Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Head2Head from Danfoss. We will today discuss scrolls versus pistons, compressors. We have John Broughton there, you can see, and we also have Jorg Saar there. We will be diving into the discussion, what is best. But before that, let me just put a few frames around this discussion today. We can't help it, but we are Danfoss, so that's what we know most of. And there's a lot of different manufacturers out there who can a lot of other things than what we do at Danfoss. So please bear with us with this, our angle. We'll focus on commercial refrigeration. So there'll be quite a few different types of compressors that we'll simply have to skip for this session here. When you write us, and please do so, we will live out of your questions. We are simply depending on your questions. So please write us all your questions. Anything goes, essentially. But please let us know from where you are writing, and then put the question to us. But before we actually go into the thing, let us just have a small poll. You could say an entry poll. What do you like the most? Is it piston or is it scroll that you like? Please let us know on your, yeah. In a moment. But meanwhile, let's just dive into the different technologies. John, could you please give us a description of how a piston works, please?
Hi, Jens, certainly. So piston machine is as what it says. It's a piston. Now I've got some bits on my desk here. So essentially a piston machine, as the name suggests, it works with a piston. So here we have a piston and a conrod. The conrod is connected to the crankshaft, and the crankshaft's connected to the motor. And you know, the piston goes up and down within the bore. On top of the piston, we have the valve plate. So then we have a piston valve plate, and that would be in a cylinder. So, you know, we think of a car engine basically. But as the piston pulls down, then it draws in the suction vapor through the valve plate into the cylinder. And then as that piston compresses, it compresses the refrigerant gas and exits through the discharge reeds. So basically, if we think about our valve plate, our piston, we're going up and down within the cylinder wall and we're compressing. So piston machine uses a piston. That's the simplest way to explain it. And if we think about car engine, motorbike engine, you know, it's a piston machine.
Yeah. Okay. So Jorg, how does scroll work? Could you please tell us?
Yeah, at least I can try to. Unfortunately, I don't have any parts here. But what I could do, I mean, you see this one, and there are these scrolls. There is a fixed scroll and a moving scroll. The fixed is of course fixed. The moving one is a wobbly movement, and by that it generates compression chambers. Well, now you might say wobbly movement. How does that look like? Let me try to share something with you. So hopefully you can see that then. And then you see how that wobbly movement builds up these compression chambers. Now hopefully you should see something. Let me make that bigger. There you have the compressor shell, motor inside, just a normal electric motor which rotates, and then you have a special coupling, a special device which makes that wobbly movement of that blue-greenish moving scroll, and by that compression chambers are generated, and they work their way inwards, get smaller, and by that the refrigerant is compressed, and then the refrigerant is pressed out in the middle and comes out of the scroll shell as well.
Right.
As just a short info.
Yes. Jörg, when and why did the scroll technology actually gain ground? I mean, let's start with the historic, you could say.
Well, the scroll is not extremely new. The idea of the scroll is already a bit older. You can imagine, however, that it is a bit difficult to machine that precise enough to do that wobbly movement in a controlled way and so on. So roughly 20 something years ago, scrolls started to come into the refrigeration business. And they gained ground mainly in the air conditioning area. Air conditioning and then heat pumps, that's where scrolls were at home and where they started to come in. And the main reason for that is that you can optimize a scroll compressor pretty good to certain operating conditions. And the scroll is really very efficient around these design conditions. And air conditioning, I mean, come on, it's pretty much the same condition quite often. Indoors you have a certain temperature, or if you build a chiller you have a certain water supply temperature, so you have a pretty constant condition there, and that's where you can optimize your scroll, and that's why you get a higher efficiency at that optimization point. And that's the main reason why the scrolls came in.
Yeah. John, do you have any comments to that? I mean, Pistons has been around for, well, quite a while, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, piston machines, we're probably talking, the best part of 100 years, I guess, Jens. It was the original refrigeration compressor going back to when refrigeration first started. I think that was about 1915-ish, something like that. So basically from then until now, the development of the piston machine has been ongoing, and that's been extensive during that time. So if we think of the sort of time span of a piston machine, we're talking well over 100 years, and a scroll sort of 20 years or so. I totally agree with Jorg, and the actual technology to machine and manufacture, whether it is a piston or whether it's a scroll compressor, has developed fantastically since those days. As Jorg sort of alluded to, the piston machine can offer a very interesting and sometimes a much more efficient alternative in the world of applications. Now, if we have things like a wide operating range, blast freeze, blast chill, where we're going from one temperature to another, it is more energy efficient over that span. Things like high condensing temperature, again, a piston machine is much more efficient, but it's very difficult to say, because I don't think there is a general statement that we could say one is better than another. They work in their own environment and their own application.
Yeah.
That's true. And maybe if I can jump in there a little bit, coming back to that efficiency, as mentioned before, a scroll is designed around a certain operating point. And can I share my screen again? I try. Just to a bit of an explanation about that. Hopefully you can see a slide again. But first of all, let's start with this one. That's a scroll again, when it sucks in, or the scroll set sucks in the refrigerant, and then it compresses the refrigerant by that wobbly movement down to a certain volume, and then the refrigerant will be pushed out. But there is a fixed relation between the volume the scroll takes in and it compresses the volume too. So there is a so-called compression ratio. Let's say it sucks in at 3 bar and you have a compression ratio of 4, then that 3 bar multiplied by the compression ratio of 4, you end up at 12 bar. And that's the optimal point for that scroll then, when it operates at the 12 bar discharge and and the 3-bar suction for a compressor which is designed for 4, the factor of 4. If you have a factor of 2.5, you can calculate what would be the best point, for example. And at that point, at that best point, that's where the scroll has the best efficiency. When you go away from that point, the scroll efficiency goes down. And as John said, there are areas where a piston can win in efficiency, and there are areas where a scroll can win. So it's not black and white. Scroll is always better than piston, but some areas, sorry to say, John, but the scroll is difficult to beat when you have it really close to its defined operating point.
Yeah. Can I just kick in here because we have a result of the poll.
Ooh.
We have a slight win in the scrolls with 10 and 8 for piston. So there's a
thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Damn.
Are we ready for the first question?
Always.
Definitely.
It's James Steiger who asks, what is the life expectancy of a scroll versus a piston? And the serviceability.
If you treat both of them in a good way, then I would say they have a very similar life expectancy. But that's if you treat them in the right way. If you don't, well, then it depends a lot on the compressor design itself as well, and not necessarily only the technology, but the compressor design as well. How much you can torture a compressor and how long it will stay. But if you really operate them in their application envelope and treat them well, I don't see a major difference.
I think I would say the same thing, Jorg. I think it's very much about looking after that machine, whether it's the quantity of oil in the crankcase, whether it's the superheat coming back to the machine, whether it's the discharge temperature, things like that. I think they're both very much of a muchness. I might be right, I might be wrong, and we can discuss the point. Discharge temperature on a scroll rises far quicker than it does in a piston machine. At least that's what I would say. If it starts to run outside the envelope, Jorg, please come back and say yes or no, or argue the point on that. But yeah, I think so long as they're both looked after and respected, then yeah, I think the life expectancy is the same.
There was one other part of that question, and yeah, which is about serviceability. I mean, if you have both of them as hermetic compressors, well, then there is a welded shell around them, so you cannot really access them. And most scrolls are hermetic. There are some in the market who are semi-hermetic, but that's rare that you see a semi-hermetic scroll. Typically, a scroll is a hermetic compressor. Of course, then, John, and that's to you, then again, if you have a semi-hermetic piston, serviceability is then a point for the piston. Yeah,
definitely. It's difficult because, as Jens said, we're talking Danfoss, so all the Danfoss piston machines and all the Danfoss scroll machines are hermetic. But yeah, if it was a semi, then piston is serviceable. I do know of one semi scroll. It's not a Danfoss make. They were quite large machines, and you could actually take the head off. But that's going back in history a little bit.
We have another question which we have touched upon, I think, but let's hear your answers anyway. It's from Kasper Kafal. Why is scroll better in specific applications and or operating points? Could you please expand on that?
Yeah, it is really because of that fact that the scroll by design has a compression ratio. A piston compressor does not have that. A piston sucks in the refrigerant, the piston comes up, compresses it until you have reached a pressure that is high enough to discharge. The valve opens and it discharges. The scroll by design is different. The scroll sucks in the refrigerant and compresses it. It cannot discharge before the compression is ended. So it compresses that refrigerant to a certain point, and that point is given by design. How you design that scroll set. Again, to bring in an example, let's say the compression ratio is 3 and your suction pressure is 5 bar, then inside the scroll set, that refrigerant will be compressed to 15 bar, 3 times 5. If that compression ratio is 3 and your suction pressure is 5. So 3 times 5, 15 bar. When you now operate at these conditions, that you meet that designed pressure ratio, that's where you get a really good efficiency. If you go away from that, you have losses. You either over compress. Let's say your discharge is only 12, so you compress inside the scroll set to 15, but you don't need them, and then it is discharged and you lose these 3 bars from 15 to 12. They are useless. You have compressed too much, put too much work in it. That gives you a lower efficiency. The same goes when you have, let's say, 21 bar discharge instead of 15. So inside the scroll set, you have a compression to 15 bar. And now, how do you get to 21? Well, because there is new refrigerant coming up and pushing the already compressed refrigerant, like, go, 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 just go, get out of here. And that's how you get a kind of after compression, which is not efficient. And you lose efficiency again. So if you really are close to that best point, that's where you have the high efficiency of a scroll, that internal pressure ratio. That is given by design. I hope that was okay as an explanation.
I think I got it at least. So you could say you could turn that answer around 180 degrees and say you will have to buy that particular scroll which fits exactly to your application. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, and you need to make sure that as a designer of a scroll, that you think about where should that scroll be used? Should that be an air conditioning scroll? Should that be, for example, a scroll compressor for medium temp refrigeration applications, for low temperature refrigeration applications? And that's where you put your sweet spot.
Yeah.
Where you typically have the operating condition.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I'm hijacking that a bit with another slide I have, but I have just a slide collection, and hopefully that helps you a little bit. Just to highlight that there is this pressure ratio, there's this built-in pressure ratio, and if you hit that, that's the blue curve of a scroll, the efficiency of the scroll along the pressure ratio. So if you hit that sweet spot where it is designed for, you have a really high efficiency. If you go away from that, the efficiency drops. For a piston compressor, the efficiency drop is far, far lower. Sometimes that curve of a piston is even more flat. So the further you go away from this sweet spot of the scroll, the better chance you have to have a higher efficiency with a piston.
It's
if
worth
you hit the sweet spot, it's scroll.
Yep. It's worth mentioning, Jorg, on that point about the piston and its efficiency, because what we do nowadays, let's say, if we look at, I won't use that piston because it has a hole in it. If I use this piston, so you can see, where's my camera? There we go. So you can see the shape of the piston. Now, that piston is shaped basically to fit in that valve plate. So there's very, very little clearance in there. And that's the way that we get good efficiency within a piston machine, because we have to have some clearance volume between the piston itself and the valve plate. Otherwise, we would cause some damage. So there is a very, very slight gap in there, which is our clearance volume. Doing myself an injustice, With a scroll, you don't have that because the flanks of the scroll actually touch, so you don't have a clearance volume. Maybe you have an oil film, but you don't have a built-in clearance volume. On a piston machine, you do, but we get the efficiency better and better by we shape the piston to the valve plate, so we actually fit very, very snugly. In the early days, that piston would have been flat, so like so, and then that valve plate would have been there, and then you would have a much larger, let's say, clearance area on the machine itself. So I'll put those back again.
And by the way, that's one point why the scroll is more efficient at the sweet spot as well. You don't have a suction valve. A normal piston compressor has a suction valve. A scroll compressor has no suction side valve. It has typically a valve on the discharge side, because you don't want it to turn backwards when you switch it off. That's why it has a valve there. But you don't have the suction valve. You don't have a pressure drop on the suction valve, which makes it more efficient if you hit the right conditions.
Great. Thank you. That's really something. We have another question from Amit Shinde. From a maintenance point of view, which one would be the better option if we want to reduce maintenance costs? Can you say something? John, I guess it's you first.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to that topic before. If we're talking a hermetic machine, whether it's a scroll or whether it's a piston, the maintenance of that machine, if you like, is to make sure that the suction temperature, suction pressure is right, superheat's right, discharge temperature is right, we've got a nice clean condenser, we're not flooding liquid back to the compressor, things like that. If you talk about maintenance from a semi-hermetic, and I'm talking a large semi-hermetic here, then obviously if you have issues with pistons or bearings or things like that, then you can do replacements. But if we talk Danfoss, then everything is hermetic, so you can't service the machine apart from ensuring that we have the correct oil level within the compressor crankcase. And as you know, I always say that oil is the lifeblood of the machine. So, we need to make sure that we've got oil in that crankcase. So maintenance point of view for me, yes, we need to look at the machine, but the compressor is the heart of the system, but it's the system itself, the condenser, the evaporator, the expansion valve, that actually look after that machine. So the maintenance is the system and the machine. And I would probably say the system first and the machine last. So I hope that's some form of thinking of my side. Jorg, any comments?
No, not really. The only comment, but I know you can counter that now already, might be that I say, well, piston had somewhat a challenge when you go down to very low condensing temperatures. So, and many piston compressors needed to have a minimum condensing temperature or a minimum pressure difference, that kind of thing, to run stable, to avoid that you get instability kind of in the design. That was for a scroll as well, but the scroll could go down even further in the past. But yeah, Danfoss has been working on that. So John, now our pistons can do that as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but interesting question nonetheless, for sure.
We have another one here. We may need a bit more info, but Sahasha Gupta is asking, what could be the cause for discharge gas passing from a running compressor into the scroll compressor? Is that something you can answer right away?
Yeah, maybe. So I assume we talk about compressors in parallel in that case, that we have, let's say, 2 or 3 or more compressors in parallel in the same circuit. Now let's say 2. One compressor is running, the other one is standing still, and there is discharge gas passing into the compressor which is not running. If that is the question, then my first guess would be that this discharge valve on the scroll, so on where you have the inner circle of that scroll, there is a discharge valve sitting. And this discharge valve is most probably not tight. And then the gas can go backwards into the scroll, which is standing. That's the only idea I have now.
I could also think of an issue, Jorg. I don't know whether this is the same, but he might be talking about the relief valve that's built inside the machine. So if you get a certain pressure difference between suction and discharge on that machine, then that pressure relief valve will lift and it will bypass internally within the compressor. That might also be what he's making reference to. But yeah.
Okay, but then you don't necessarily have from one to the other compressor. It should even happen in the compressor that is running, because that relief valve acts on a pressure difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, potentially.
Yeah, we got another question from Swedish Menon. Hope I'm pronouncing that sort of correct. It's something that we have actually touched upon before, but let's just repeat it again. Which technology has lower life cycle costs, scrolls or pistons? And that must also be including the purchasing, I guess, and installation, I guess.
Yeah, and however, a lot of the costs come from really paying the energy to run the system, and then hit the sweet spot of a scroll. You have the better efficiency, and off you go. That's where you have the lower lifetime cost. If you operate all the time very close to that sweet spot. I know what John is now going to say, that there are systems which are not all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. But it's an interesting thought or question, because what actually costs to produce scroll or piston, equal capacity, blah blah blah, probably very very similar. What is easier to repair? I would probably say a piston machine, whether it is a remanufacture machine or whatever. But yeah, from the running cost point of view, I have to bow down, Jorg, a little bit, because as you say, if that scroll is running in the sweet spot, then it will be more energy efficient. But again, it depends on the application.
Yeah, sure. Another one. Abdul Wayed Sayed, again, excuse my pronunciation. Kindly elaborate on refrigerant piping of scrolls and a piston compressor. Are there any, and this is my question, additional question to this one, are there any differences in piping for scrolls and pistons?
That's a interesting question. I would say no. As we come back to what I said before, we need to make sure that compressor functions. We need to make sure it has oil in the crankcase. We need to make sure that the suction velocity coming back to that machine is correct. Between 8-12 meters a second, something like that. And I would say whether it is scroll or a piston, those suction velocities, are the same. A question that's coming into my mind at the moment is which machine actually throws out more oil from the compression process. Is it a piston or is it a scroll? And I honestly can't give an answer to that. Jorg, thoughts on that one?
Yes, I'm drawing something.
Yeah.
Well, agree. Yes, basically similar. Yeah. Of course, you have different connection points where you need to connect your suction lines and discharge lines, but that's not what we talk about. A difference I could see is if you have compressors in parallel, because on a piston compressor, you typically do something like that. Can you see that?
Mhm.
So you come in with the suction line, assuming you have 4 compressors in parallel, you come in with the suction line and you distribute so that you have an even pressure drop to all your compressors. You can do that with a scroll as well. Works fine. That's where we have something similar. What is possible, however, as well, is that you do something else, and let me draw that here. With at least with Danfoss scroll compressors. How do I make this a little bit thinner to that one, and then a little bit thinner to that one? I don't know whether that's really good to see, but you have 3 compressors here. The first one, you come in with the big suction line, and then you get thinner and thinner with the suction line, because of course the last compressor takes less refrigerant. So you don't need to make that special distribution there. This one, you can simplify your suction line. To be able to do that, however, you need to know exactly, or you need to specify what pressure drop you have here in between the compressors, so that the last compressor has a little bit lower pressure than the first one. And the idea of that is that in case only the last one is running, refrigerant comes in, most of the oil goes into the first one, and then these compressors are connected via oil lines. So if this one has a slightly lower pressure, it sucks oil from the first one into the last one. So it's doing its own oil management. That needs to be made, that it works. It needs to fit to the compressors, but that's a possibility you can do with Danfoss compressors, and you get even these oil pipes with these reduction pipes, so that you have exactly the pressure drop you want to have to be able to transport the oil. And just to mention that, you cannot suck the first compressor completely empty, because there is a certain oil level. Here, that's the first one. There's a certain oil level that cannot go lower. So there is always enough oil in that compressor, even if the last one constantly tries to take oil out of that compressor. But there's a lower limit. That's the difference I see.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. Quite interesting, actually. We have another one here, and yeah, I am a bit curious also to what the answer will be. Bernardo Ramalho is asking, how is the difference for CO2 refrigeration, scroll versus piston technology? Who will take that one? Jorg?
Yeah, however, I cannot say a lot about that, to be honest, because I have no experience with scroll compressors for CO2. There has so far not been a lot in the market, and on scroll compressors for CO2. So I really cannot say anything about that. So CO2 compressors were piston compressors typically. So that's why I cannot really talk about a difference there.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think it's difficult because we don't work on that. So
no.
Yeah.
Another one from Thomas Adams. Which compressor is more forgiving to liquid slugging?
Oh, that's a good one.
Who's going to take the first with that one? John?
Well, John can counter whatever I say, but okay, let's give it a try. So I could say, and I'm going to say, well, it depends a bit on how your scroll is built. We talk about hermetic compressors now, right? To have a fair comparison. So now you have the compressor shell. First of all, the liquid is coming into that shell, and now the oil might foam and so on, and you might get some liquid or a mixture of liquid refrigerant and foam, or only foam, which goes down to liquid oil in the compression chamber. now you have the possibility to build a scroll in a way that this moving scroll, you have these two scrolls, one is standing still, the other one is doing this wobbly movement, and that moving scroll, you can build the scroll compressor in a way that it goes away a little bit to the side. If there is liquid pushing from the side saying, hey, I don't have any space, then that moving scroll moves away a bit, and the liquid does not destroy the scroll. So that's one option. I need to admit, not every scroll is built in that way, because that design has some disadvantages as well. You have a constant friction there, and you can build a scroll compressor so you don't have that friction, but then that moving scroll is not able to go away to the side a little bit. Yeah, but then, John, what would you say?
I'd probably say, as a general statement, and I say this during training also, a refrigeration compressor is a vapor pump and it's not a liquid pump. So, they're not designed to pump liquid. Whether it is a piston machine or a scroll machine, you do have a shell volume, and general statement, a piston hermetic machine has a larger shell volume than a scroll. So it's able to cope with more liquid within the shell. Now, what I learned from a very good friend of mine who no longer works from Danfoss is a compressor, he liked it to an aeroplane. When the aeroplane's flying in midair, everything's fine. It's the taking off of the landing bit that's the dangerous part. And I think the same with a compressor. If you start it and it has liquid in the bottom, then you're going to dilute the oil, and it's going to cause some problems. Again, if you stop it and it's full of liquid, we get the same issue. When it's running, let's say it can cope with that because that liquid that comes back will boil off. Still don't like oil, still don't like liquid in the crankcase for sure. But I think, general statement, a piston machine would have a larger shell volume to be able to cope with liquid coming back. And obviously, as that liquid vapor mix gets entrained, if we think of our scroll machine, and I can put our lovely picture up. If I share the screen a second, when it decides to behave itself, joys of technology. So you're probably seeing the wrong slide, so hopefully you're seeing the right one now, and that's the wrong slide as well. So there we go. Hopefully that's the right slide you're seeing now. So we have our motion work down here, our piston. For that liquid to enter that chamber, it has to come basically up the side of the motor, through the suction, through the windings, and then into the chamber.
John, we can't see anything.
Can't see anything, right? Okay.
Well, but I can see something, but not your slide. I mean, I can see my coffee cup here, and
there we go.
Now we can. That's better. That's better. Sorry for that. I just put it into presentation mode and it just blanked out both screens. But here we can see our machine. Hopefully you can see the mouse. So we have our motor, we have our shell volume here, and obviously we have the suction in. So if we do get liquid, which we shouldn't get, into our machine, it's going to fall into this shell volume here, and then the vapor gets pulled up and through the motor windings. They're 100% suction gas cooled. So the challenge is actually getting liquid in and over and into the bores. It happens because we know that when we get the machines back through warranty and there's not much left, but there is quite a big shell volume in there to cope with that. But that said, like I said before, it's a vapor pump, it's not a liquid pump. And as for the mechanicals of coping with liquid, we've all been on site on a Friday night doing the 5 o'clock charge, and you hear the machine, make a bit of a noise. That's pumping liquid. That's not a good thing, because the first thing that goes are the reeds in the head, as we know. Let me stop sharing the screen. and my mouse is now misbehaving, so stop sharing screen. So that is a typical, valve head. We've got reeds in there, and the first thing that'll go is the suction reed, and the discharge reeds will destroy themselves, and eventually they'll bounce through the piston like so. So you're lucky if that happens, or it'll seize up and physically break the conrods. So it's not a good thing to start and pump liquid. But as for which can pump liquid better than the other, I wouldn't. I'd probably say they're both pretty similar, to be honest. Just don't do it.
Yeah. We have another question. I think it's related to something we discussed early on, and I presume it's about the scrolls. Jorg, you were saying something about the possibility of compression buildup. So the question sounds from Vesko Stoyanov: isn't the weak point in the end of the chamber where the pressure builds up over and over again?
I mean, in the middle.
Yeah.
Kind of in the middle where the refrigerant is compressed and then leaves the scroll set. Not really, because you design, of course, for the pressures you want the compressor to operate in, and you have the advantage that the more you go to the middle, the smaller kind of your circle is. You get a higher pressure than at the outside, but your circle, your area where the pressure works is smaller, and that is not really a weak point. I don't see anything where I could say, well, scroll compressors, if they break, they typically break there. That's not what I see.
No, I would say the same, Jorg. I mean, that part of the scroll, I've always known it as the nose of the scroll. Don't know why. That's just the terminology that I was given. But I know what we do within Danfoss is that we have variable wrap geometry on the scroll itself, and I'm talking scrolls, not pistons. But the variable geometry basically means that the wall thickness on the scrolls is different in the parts of compression that get the most stress. And I haven't got one here, but you can see that, and where it needs to be strong, it is strong. Where it doesn't need to be as strong, it's not as strong. So I would sort of say the same thing. It's made to do a job, so it's not weaker than any other part of the scroll itself.
Yeah. We got another question from Ahmad Solani. Can the scroll compressor be rewinded if there's a short winding? And Jorg, you have an answer to that?
So if that means if the motor is short winded, so if you have a motor burn, I guess that's no. Is the simple answer, because that's a hermetic machine.
Yeah.
But you have the same thing for a hermetic compressor. So it's really a hermetic machine. You cannot open that shell. I mean, you can, but then your compressor is gone. So on hermetic compressors, they are not made to rewind the motor.
Oh.
I mean, they are not made for that, right? If somebody comes along and says, yeah, but I can cut that open, take it out, rewind it myself, weld the whole thing close, and do whatever. Can is one thing, yeah, but should you do it? Are they designed to do that? Clear no.
Yeah. I mean, everything is possible, right? Yeah. Sagar Patil, he is asking, in case of flooding, how does the piston and the scroll compressor behave when being flooded?
They are very unhappy. Both of them. Yeah, as John said, these machines are made to compress gas.
Yeah,
they are not made to pump liquid around, and then it doesn't matter. Both try somehow to do that, and if it's too much liquid, then you damage the compressors, no matter which one. If it is a little bit somehow a bit is what compressors can somehow handle and survive. But if you do that too often or too much liquid, then you damage compressors no matter what.
Yeah,
Agree.
right. We again we are sort of, I don't know if we're picking up questions from earlier on, but David Wright, he's asking here, what exactly do you mean when you refer to the sweet spot on a scroll? Jorg, I'm afraid you'll have to repeat what you said.
That's fine. Well, a scroll has a built-in, due to its geometrical design, has a built-in pressure ratio. So inside the scroll set itself, refrigerant is compressed from the suction pressure to a certain pressure, and that certain pressure is given by the designed pressure ratio of the scroll. So depends on how you design a scroll, then you have a certain pressure ratio. Let's take 3 again, because I don't want to take 3.26. You can do that yourself and do that on the calculator, but I just take 3 because that's easier to calculate. And then we have, let's say, 5 bar suction pressure. 5 times 3, 15. So in the scroll set itself, the refrigerant is compressed to 15 bar. When you now have these operating conditions that you meet the pressure ratio where the scroll is designed, that's the sweet spot. Close to these conditions, the scroll is great.
Okay. Sagar Patil is asking, which compressor will have better control over discharge gas temperature, of course?
Well, now I could be not nice to John and say it's a scroll. It is, but only if you have a certain design of the scroll. So in general, your discharge temperature comes from your suction conditions and your condensing temperature. So whatever you take in as a suction gas, you compress that, and you end up at a given discharge temperature. That's thermodynamics. The compressor design doesn't make a difference, really. But now there are scrolls which have an injection port. There are, for example, there is, for example, the possibility that you inject liquid in between the scroll set. So in the scroll set itself, you inject liquid, and that cools down the liquid that is compressed in the scroll set. And by doing that, of course, you reduce your discharge temperature. But that's only if you have that injection, and you need to control that injection in a good way to avoid too much refrigerant there. But that's how you can reduce your discharge temperature, and by that can enlarge your envelope, only if you have that technology.
And you know what, Jorg? Christopher Ganjemi is actually asking, what is the liquid injection and vapor injection into refrigeration scrolls? When and why is that needed? So, well,
it's exactly that. I just took the example of liquid injection. So you can inject liquid into the compression chamber of the scroll. And you do that when you already have compressed the refrigerant, the suction gas a bit, and that gets warmer. And then you say, let's inject some more liquid there to cool down that refrigerant. You can, of course, inject gas there as well to cool that down. There are advantages and disadvantages for both systems. Liquid injection is a bit easier. Gas injection, you need to build up the gas, you need to have an extra evaporator, extra expansion valve, and so on. But both is basically there to cool down the gas while you compress it.
Mm-hmm. It's probably worth mentioning, and this is not a counter argument, but the discharge temperature on a scroll, if you work outside or very close to the envelope and outside of the operating envelope, that discharge gas temperature can increase very, very, very quickly. And yet, as Jorg said, you can use liquid injection to keep that scroll and the discharge temperature correct via a discharge gas thermostat. What I would always say, and again I use this when I'm doing the training sessions, is that if we're on particularly low temperature scroll, I would always fit a discharge gas thermostat on that machine to protect it, because if you go outside of the envelope, if the suction superheat starts to get too high, that discharge temperature will increase quite rapidly, and yeah, you'll damage the scroll set. And I know you could counter that argument, Jorg, with a recip, but I would say the discharge temperature in a recip probably more affects the oil rather than the actual valve plate and assembly.
Yeah, and I have to admit there is one point when you go out of the application envelope. As mentioned, a scroll has an internal pressure ratio. So the gas is always compressed according to that internal compressor ratio in the scroll set itself, no matter what your condensing temperature or your condensing pressure is. So if your suction pressure gets too high, let's say usually the scroll has only maximum 12 bar suction gas, but now your suction gas gets too high in pressure due to whatever reason. Now it gets to 20. Internally, if we still take the three pressure ratio of 3 designed in the scroll set, 3 times 20 is 60. So in the scroll set, it will be compressed to 60 bar, no matter what. Even if your condensing pressure is only 40, it will be compressed to 60 in the scroll set. Advantage piston. I get it. Yes, because the piston will compress to 40 and discharge. The scroll cannot do that. Well, if you don't put a so-called IDV, intermediate discharge valve, into the scroll. So you can put additional discharge valves in the scroll, not only the one in the middle, but additional ones. They keep closed when you have not reached the discharge pressure yet, but they open up and release the refrigerant into the discharge side, so that the scroll will not completely compress it into the middle of the scroll, but will release it before. So that's how you can get rid a bit of that fall down of efficiency on a scroll compressor when you go out of its sweet spot.
Great.
Agree.
We have another interesting question from Daud Edgaf. Does Danfoss have product line on explosion-proof compressors? And I could guess that it has something to do with A2L, A3 refrigerants, maybe.
That might be. The answer is pretty simple. No, there is no explosion-proof compressor. So there is no compressor that has an ATEX approval. That would be how I see it. That's how I understand it, right? That question. Explosion-proof means ATEX approval, that you can use the compressor in an explosive environment. Danfoss does not offer these compressors. Coming back to your question, Jens, what about A2L? Or maybe if we talk about piston, even A3 refrigerants, so flammable refrigerants, don't I need to have an ATEX approval? The answer is no, you don't need that. And now it's getting a bit complicated, but let's try to simplify it. The reason why not. The ATEX guideline says under normal operating conditions, that's when you have an explosive atmosphere. So under normal operating conditions, that's, for example, inside the tank of your car. That under normal operating conditions, that's filled with petrol. So inside the tank of your car, there is an explosion possible environment. You need to have inside your tank, you need to have an ATEX environment. That's under normal conditions. But then there is a standard which says for refrigeration systems, under normal operating conditions, they are tight. So they are leak tight. No refrigerant comes out. That means under normal operating conditions, you don't have an explosive atmosphere, even if you have a flammable refrigerant. And that means under normal operating conditions, you don't need ATEX. hopefully that was not too complicated to make that as a very short argument and not too confusing.
That's fine. Actually, Elango is asking about R290 or R290. Which technology do have more design advantages between piston and scrolls when we're using R290?
I don't know. I mean,
I don't really see an advantage for no
either. I think a lot of it, Jorg, at the moment would come down to charge size. And for the charge sizes that we have at the moment, then you'd be talking, small black piston machines, at least from, Danfoss viewpoint.
Yeah.
I don't think we're at that level yet for charge size to go into scroll.
Yeah, and it all comes back to the same arguments as for other refrigerants. It is the application. So if you use R290 in an area where you have pretty good where you're close to the sweet spot of the scroll gives you an advantage. If you have something that where you don't have that, where you operate very, very often, kind of most of the time all over the place, you don't necessarily have the scroll advantage. So I don't really see something. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry for being a bit distant. There are questions coming in here. Just for the record, we will answer questions, written answers in the chats afterwards, after this live session here, because I'm afraid we won't be able to answer all the questions. So if you feel that we haven't answered your question, please have a look into the chat after this this live session when we close down at some point in time. But we may be able to answer the last question, maybe from Hussam Mohammed. Are there any preferences for specific refrigerants rather than others, comparing scrolls and piston compressors?
I don't see that for commercial refrigeration.
No, the same. I think it comes down to the application and the duty that we're talking about. For example, if we talk large industrial ammonia, then we're talking big screw, big recip, because physically of the duty. If we come back to commercial refrigeration, no, I think it all comes down to the application, as Jorg said, and that the evaporating temperature, condensing temperature of where we're working at. I think that is the deciding factor rather than the compressor technology itself.
Yeah, and maybe one point to that, it might very well happen that you don't see scrolls for certain refrigerants, but that is typically because then the manufacturer of the scroll has decided, I want to make my scroll as an air conditioning scroll. Again, the sweet spot, right? The scroll looks at an application and is made for a certain application. Just assuming you build air conditioning scrolls only, then of course you don't use a refrigerant that is used in low temp refrigeration, because then you make your scrolls for air conditioning refrigerants. So, but if you want to make a scroll for low temperature refrigeration, which is possible, I mean, Danfoss has so scrolls like that, then you can do that, and then you have the scroll for that refrigerant that is typically used for low temperature refrigeration as well.
Okay, so let's take the last question here. It's from Vesko Stoyanov. How will the scrolls get oil through the moving parts if they are pumping gas phase refrigerants?
in the crankshaft turns, and in the crankshaft there is a hole. That hole is not completely straight down, it's a little bit like this. And now if it turns, it's doing that movement kind of, and by that movement oil is sucked upwards, and then there are small drillings which are connected to the crankshaft, and that's where the oil comes out again. Now you might say, yeah, but it's still oil, it's still liquid, and you said it's made to pump gas. Correct. However, the amount of oil compared to the amount of gas is really, really small. There's just a little bit of oil, which is then going through these scroll sets. And since you design your oil pump yourself, if you build that scroll, then you know pretty much how much oil will be transported, and you really take care about that in the design of the scroll, so that the oil is no issue, that the oil can be transported through the scroll set. And it's really just maximum something like 2-3% in that range. So that's no issue.
Great.
And we talk about mass percent, right? Not even volume.
Yeah. Before we end, I think we need to have a second call. You know, if we have changed anyone's opinion about the scroll versus pistons, could you please answer whether you now prefer piston or scroll? Yeah. Good, but I'll just sorry.
Thanks a lot to all those who have asked questions. Jens, you've been so kind to monitor all the questions. I have not been looking into that. Let me open something. I just want to see where all our listeners and participants came from, and just looking at the names, I get the impression that we talk about kind of everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So I can see names which I would put towards India, other regions in Asia. I can see the Middle East, as it looks like. I can see Europe. I can see North America. Even one or two names South America when I look into the participant list. Wow, impressive, great.
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic, and thank you so much for participating. And I'm sure we'll repeat this head-to-head at another point in time. What that topic will be, or topics in plural, well, we'll see. And also, please feedback if you have anything you would like us to discuss between us. Then it would be great to hear your feedback. But thank you so much for participating today. It's been a lot of fun for I guess the three of us, at least me. I've had a good time. So, John and Jorg, any comments?
No, just the same as Jorg. Thank you ever so much for taking the time to listen in and post the questions. As Jens said in the beginning, that's what we live off. That's what makes these sessions interesting, and it's great for us to get those questions, because you might ask things that we don't actually think about that are important to the industry itself. So that helps us internally. So yeah, thanks very much. And Jens, thank you for being the the compare brilliant, and Jorg, a good adversary. So I still think Pistons are better.
Thank you. Thank you. The same to you. And by the way, to all who listen to us, be kind to your compressors. Give it some gas, superheated gas. Yes. They like that.
Yeah. Oil and superheat.
Lubrication, right? Yeah. Well, thank you so much. See you some other time. And,
thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.